Well, hello again. You will remember these two faces from our last meeting. The face of, on the one hand, well, I'll let you decide. And on the other hand, well, I'll let you decide which is which. You remember this opposition between terror and horror, framed for us very helpfully by the critic Devendra Varma, you will remember from last time. The Gothic Flame is the name of his book, which was written in 1966, which suggests to you just how much of this has changed, to the extent that this is still relevant, what he had to say back then. I read this last time, I'll read it again. Terror thus creates an intangible atmosphere of spiritual psychic dread, a certain superstitious shudder at the other world. Horror resorts to a cruder representation or presentation of the macabre by an exact portrayal of the physically horrible and revolting against a far more terrible background of spiritual gloom and despair. Horror appeals to sheer dread and repulsion by brooding upon the gloomy and the sinister, and lacerates the nerves by establishing, and I like this next phrase a lot, actual cutaneous contact with the supernatural. You have that available to you in your content collection, of course. That entire page. So that's why I read through it so quickly without any real concern. Plus, you've seen it before. I wanted at this point just to, again, in the way of recapping just a bit before moving on to what I have to say about Radcliffe for you today, for us. This opposition between horror and terror. For me, to us at this point, I just write down a few of the binaries by means of which one keeps these two terms apart. We could work through Varman. I think we'd find most of these represented for us, but I'm just going to list them out kind of rapidly for us, and I think, again, they're fairly familiar. Of course, horror trades upon what is clear to the senses, clearly to be apprehended. Terror, let's call that a phenomenon, an aesthetic affect that trades upon the opposite of clarity, obscurity, which, of course, is something that is best created by darkness. And clarity, of course, in darkness is difficult to achieve, so let's write light on that side. I think also you have a certain tangibility, the tangible, let us call it, that is to be apprehended in those moments of horror. Whereas in terror you have the opposite, the intangible. You see how this works. Objects, tangible objects, right? I'm going to call it the objective over there under horror. And then, of course, under terror, the binary of subject, subjective. The phenomenon of terror is more a phenomenon of the subject. The phenomenon of horror is more a phenomenon of the mind as it's perceiving objects and not freeing up its own subjectivity to wander as it will. You won't be surprised, given the way I just characterized the subjective versus the objective, that during these experiences of horror, you tend to be frozen, right? Unable to move, shocked, stilled with horror. Whereas you are not frozen when you're having the experience of terror. You are, in fact, all too mobile, right? And in motion, typically, distracted and not frozen in place, rooted to the spot of the spectacle or phenomenon of horror, but rather wandering in the air near the phenomenon, as it were. And I just use the phrase "in the air." I think is also illuminating, so I'll write it down. In the air versus, on the ground. The experience of horror roots one in the ground, as it were. What about the affect itself, the actual emotional response? What is the nature of one's response to these disparate phenomena? Some would say opposite phenomenon. Well, again, by way of recap, revulsion, a kind of repulsion. Revulsion is a wonderful movie. Don't watch it at home. No, you have to, right? By Roman Polanski, called Repulsion, from the 1960s. that, trust me, it is everything. It deserves that title. You have, oddly, in terror, you have a kind of condition of attraction, I think, which is very interesting. You know, and this is responsible in part for that phenomenon that we see in movies which have scenes of terror in which there's a sound in the basement, and we have usually someone very vulnerable, not like, for example, a SWAT team member, goes down into the basement and seeks out that knowledge of that, whatever that was, right? Of what is it? You don't know. Or up into the attic, which is better in keeping with this phrase in the air, I suppose. But you seem attracted by it. You're not disgusted and repulsed, pushed back, as it were, but in fact drawn forward, literally in the case of these famous experiences of terror that, again, are so conventional in the horror movies or terror movies. This final item this, you could see how this practice of accumulating binary oppositions could go on, right? But we're kind of sticking with Varma in this moment. Actual cutaneous contact as opposed to, well, not. You don't get that kind of, skin and spirit, let us say, the corporeal and the incorporeal, the spiritual, the ethereal, which is, of course, the phenomenon of terror. So you can see how these things match up very nicely for us, match up in opposition. And perhaps it will provide some illumination as we work through one scene, which is what I would like to do for the rest of this brief video. One scene in Radcliffe, the Italian. I'll be right back.